We've talked about Greece, talked about Egypt. This is Rome. Slavery in ancient Rome, an integral part of Roman society. Now, I have seen that photo before. Now, I saw that one on the Greece one. So summary. Slavery was integral to Roman society. Educated slaves could be employed. Ooh, they could be employed. Okay, so let's talk about how many slaves were in ancient Rome. Vast numbers of slaves were traded throughout the empire, from Britain in the north to Syria in the east. At the beginning of the imperial era, the ratio of slaves to freeborn people in the city of Rome could have been as high as 3-1. Slave ownership was common for those at the top of society. Plutarch tells us, I don't know who the hell Plutarch is, tells us that the Republican consul what are we talking about? Republican consul Marcus Licinius Crassus, pictured in the above left. Oh, this guy over here. Okay, cool. On the left side, neat. Owned so many slaves that he had 500 just for acquiring and rebuilding property. Okay, but it was also not uncommon for plebeians as well as ex-slaves to own a few slaves as well. Slave ownership was a sign of status and wealth, which nearly everyone in ancient Rome aspired to. I agree to that. I do think that everybody should aspire to be wealthy, and one of the best ways to do it is in a capitalist society, just hands down. It is often hard to unpick the lives of history's poorest participants, since monuments and literature usually reflect the lives of the elite. Right, well, history is written by the victors, right? The slaves of Rome are no exception. Nevertheless, Roman literature, epigraphical sources, I think I got that right, and archaeological finds all provide some information about slavery in ancient Rome. Pliny the Younger's letters are one of our best sources for Roman slavery, but written work produced by elite members of Roman society are obvious limitations. Many, like Pliny, I really need to pre-read this crap because I don't know how to pronounce any of these names. Like Pliny, were prone to idealizing the master-slave relationship. Sadly, no surviving literature is written from the viewpoint of someone actually living the life of a Roman slave. Well, a lot of them didn't know how to read or write, though, right? I mean, how did people become Roman slaves? First, again, haven't read this. I'm gonna guess same as fucking everything else, right? There's a lot of ways you could become a slave. Chief of which is likely going into debt and becoming a slave until it's paid off, or your parents going into debt and selling you as a slave until it's paid off. But then they never pay it off, and so you're a slave for 30 years and fucking die, right? If you're lucky, you'll be able to buy your own freedom by producing money if your master says it's okay. Obviously, he'll take a cut no matter how hard you work because you you belong to him. But still, there's a great example of it in The Richest Man in Babylon, where a dude gets sold to a baker and then starts trying to earn his freedom by working super hard, right? So he learned everything that the baker knew how to do because he was adamant about the baker teaching him how to do everything, and then he was now doing everything, and the baker was able to just kind of sit down and relax and enjoy his life. But the guy didn't want to be a slave for the rest of his life, so he was able to convince the baker to let him sell honey hot cross buns to the people coming in from the fields in the afternoons by using the leftover honey and flour and stuff that they had from the morning from that morning's service, right? So he'll work for him in the morning, and then the afternoons he'll use his spare time to take what was left and sell it to people to then earn more money for the baker in exchange for him keeping a profit, or however much the baker decided, in exchange for him keeping a profit of the earnings, right? So the baker said, okay, here's what's gonna happen. You will sell it for X amount. I will take half, to pay for the wood and the flour and the honey and that kind of stuff that went into making the buns that you're selling in the afternoon. Of the remaining 50%, I shall take half, and you will take half. That means that the slave guy is now able to earn a quarter of his profits. So, let's say, for example, he makes $100 that afternoon. Great, $25 is his. He gets to keep that $25. Now, does that seem fair? Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. He was allowed the ability to do that until he had enough money to pay for his freedom. Now, the story goes on a little bit to say that he, the baker expected the extra earnings and got in a bunch of debt and then ended up selling him off to another guy. So the deal that he had with the baker to buy his freedom is now null and void because the baker is no longer his master. So he's still going to be a slave until like a bunch of other shit happens, but I'm not going to get into it. The point is, he was allowed the ability to buy his freedom by like working extra, right? There were a number of routes into slavery in ancient Rome. One of the most common was being a prisoner of war. Yeah, okay, that's the most one of the most common. Yeah, that one in being in debt. The expansion of the Roman Empire from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century CE, boy, that's a long time, saw many thousands of conquered people forced into servitude. Fair enough. I mean, yeah, you're conquered, you're now my servant. Some people were sold into slavery. This could be for a number of reasons. Piracy was common across the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. Those captured by pirates were then sold on like plunder. Pirates were out there kind of just for like stealing and looting shit, right? People who could not pay their debts could even end up selling themselves into slavery in lieu of payment. Finally, there were those who were unfortunate enough to be born into slavery. Slave mothers were forced to hand their children over to their owners soon after birth. It was also not uncommon for slave owners to encourage relations between slaves in order to increase their numbers. Well, yeah, I mean, if two slaves have a kid, then the master of those two slaves owns the kid too, I would believe. Yeah, so prisoners of war and then people who could not pay their debts could often end up selling themselves into slavery in lieu of payment. So, fair enough. There we go. Look at that guy there with a bunch of house slaves. Just saying. Also, none of these house slaves look typically, how do I put it, African in facial features, if you get what I'm saying. Just saying, you know, all the lips look kind of normal sized. Anyway, there were, I'm gonna get roasted. There were many different types of slaves, and they could be found in every walk of life in ancient Rome. Domestic slaves were perhaps the most common. Some were educated or highly skilled, and therefore much sought after. Tutors for children, specialist cooks, and even hairdressers could command high prices. Well, I mean, yeah, if I have a guy that I am, let's say I'm a slave, right? But also, before I sold myself into slavery, I was a doctor or the most famous cook in Rome or some shit, right? I have those skills. I can read, I can write, I can cook. You don't have to teach me to do anything. It would not be a benefit to you to put me in the field. It would be more of a benefit to you. Even if you have to pay more for me, it would be more of a benefit to you to put me to work using the vast amount of knowledge and skills that I already have, right? So you have to keep in mind, at the end of the day, it was a business decision for these guys, so a lot of these slaves actually weren't even treated all that badly. Like, yeah, sure, there were 50 lashes for missing a day of work, and there were like, probably crappy living conditions. Well, maybe not even crappy living conditions, honestly, because you wanted them to be healthy, you wanted them to be strong and shit like that, because it would be a waste of your money if you bought somebody that was just going to keel over in the field. So, and that's the same way it was in American society too, right? Like, there were definitely beatings, there were definitely like terrible, terrible things that happened to people because like people are not property, but back then they were considered property. And I don't know if you're a property owner, but you tend to want to take care of your property, right? I'm just saying. Now, there were slumlords, but most people take care of their property, right? There were many different types of slaves, and they could be found. Okay, all right, I already read that. The success of urban life depended on an army of slaves. Yeah, because they just had armies. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was built by slaves. Ha! Do they have a chain link fence in front of that? Why won't they let people see these things anymore? What the heck? Anyway, slavery in ancient Rome was subject to various laws, mostly drawn up in favor of the masters rather than the slaves, obviously, because the masters are the ones that are helping with their taxes and shit. Slave owners had legal dominium over their slaves. Yeah, okay, so if you own slaves, it means you fucking own slave, right? Which, again, terrible thing. But obviously the laws were written around this terrible thing because back in the time they thought it was fine. The punishments of, they thought it was fine, but they also encouraged you to never become a slave. So, take that for what it is. The punishments for those who were caught were very harsh. If a slave attacked or murdered a master, then not only the perpetrator, but the entire household of slaves could be executed. Oh, man! So if somebody murders their master, you could die, but also so could every other slave that master owns. All of you. Damn. Couldn't even do like an estate sale? Fuck. It was arguably in a master's interest to treat his slaves fairly. And most probably found that this resulted in a more productive workforce. This is what I was just trying to say, right? They'd want to take care of their... It's the same way with, like, the Roman gladiators, too, right? Because they were most often slaves, but they were also paraded around like these celebrities, right? I bet you there was Roman gladiator merch. You know what I mean? Like, somebody's walking in wearing an Annihilator shirt or Maximus Decimus Aurelius, right? That... Somebody has a fucking hat that is shaped the same as some Roman gladiator's hat, right? There's probably a shop with various things, much like you'd see at any sporting event nowadays, because ultimately the gladiator games were a sporting event, right? So anyway, a lot of these guys, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of these people were taken care of pretty well. Some slaves developed close relationships with their masters built on mutual respect, including, for example, the famous orator and politician Cicero and his personal secretary Tiro. The following extract is taken from a letter sent by Cicero's brother to Cicero on hearing that Tiro was to be set free. It highlights the genuine affection held for Tiro throughout the family. I'm not going to read that. I don't care. But it does point out that, like... While you are someone's property, it doesn't mean they wouldn't be able to treat you with respect. At least in ancient Rome, right? So, here it talks about the gladiators. It is perhaps a step too far to describe gladiators as the glamorous representatives of slavery in ancient Rome, but some became very well known and lived their lives in the spotlight. See, they were slaves, but they were also celebrities. So, whatever. Again, dude, there's got to be merch here somewhere, for sure. I fucking know it. Okay, so anyway, how could Roman slaves earn their freedom? I think we already kind of covered that. There were various ways the king could pardon them. They could buy their freedom. They could have, like, the debt paid off. Various, or the master could just get a wild hair up their ass and be like, yeah, you're set free, I don't care anymore, whatever. So anyway, yeah, so that's slavery in ancient Rome. Interesting. But what was life really like, right? So let's see what Infographics has to say about what life was like for a Roman slave during the Roman Empire. Because he was there, probably. I don't know. I have no idea how old this person is. But this is their YouTube channel. This is Infographics. I've reacted to him a hell of a lot before. I agree with him on a lot of things. I disagree with him on other things, but I think honestly he tries his best to stay in the center, and then So we'll see. The horrible life of an American Jesus Christ. The horrible life of an average Roman Empire slave. Let's go.
This video was made possible by Wix. If you're ready to create a website, head on over to wix.com/go. Slaves done as some wicked slave driver stood behind them with a whip in his hand. Many of the slaves were domestic servants. Some were skilled artisans. Others were even said to be highly educated.
Also, listen, I just want to point this out. They have these blonde ones up here always in these things because they're like supposed to be more beautiful, but I like brunettes. I'm just saying.
Physicians. The ones who did generally have a very hard life were those that were doing their time as property of a Roman as punishment. Life for these people was brutal and often very short. For that reason, there were sometimes slave revolts, with the one you all probably know about led by the slave Spartacus. This former gladiator and military leader took part in what are now called the Servile Wars. But what about the average Joe slaves?
I mean, Spartacus was kind of shafted, I'm just saying.
So, as Roman slaves lived such diverse lives, let's start with the great Spartacus. The Greek writer Plutarch tells us that Spartacus was a
Spartacus is a great example of how anybody, no matter where they come from, could become a slave. It doesn't matter what your background is at all.
Thracian by birth, who had once served as a soldier with the Romans, but had since been a prisoner and sold for a gladiator.
Yeah.
If he indeed was Thracian, then that would mean he came from what we now call Bulgaria, or possibly Greece or Turkey. While sources differ, it's said that Spartacus was first captured by Roman legions and then trained in gladiatorial school. If you've seen our show on what sometimes went down in the Roman Colosseum, you'll know that gladiators didn't exactly have an easy life. What do we know about the schools? Well, these prisoners of war were kept often two to a cell. They were
Maximus is another good example, right? Because he was a Roman general before becoming a slave.
in fact in prison, but each day
General of their armies to slave in a day.
they would train outside of their cells in an arena. Gladiators had different kinds of skills and training methods, and Thracian gladiators practiced in the art of swordsmanship. National Geographic tells us that the slaves were not allowed out of the fortress unless being taken to the Colosseum or another arena. But
Okay.
while the cells were not exactly a great place to live, it's said that there were heated floors for winter, baths, and an infirmary. And the
Hold
slaves
on.
lived in
Heated floors? Jeez.
confines that were equipped with plumbing. Historians say these gladiators were highly valued slaves, and so they were kept in good condition so they could fight well. These
Yes.
slaves, we're told, usually would not die or even be treated too badly in their prison. They occupied a 32 square foot cell, which, as we said, was probably shared with one more person. They trained day in and day out all year round, and trained not as a team but as individuals. When the time came, they were often taken out of the training school and sent to fight in an arena somewhere. So the life of a gladiator slave, probably a much better existence than hard labor, but obviously they could find themselves in a very bad place being pitted against a starving lion. That's likely one of the reasons why Spartacus decided to plot against the Romans and head for the hills. It's believed he was captured and killed, with many of his followers also dying by way of crucifixion. But perhaps a fate worse than being trained to fight in an arena was hard labor. After all, someone had to build those great cities in the ancient empire, mine the precious metals.
The Roman aqueducts, I believe you can put 4 chariots side by side across the bottom of it, right? They're fucking huge. They according to some books that I've read, the aqueducts in ancient Rome rivaled the largest of aqueducts in like Colorado and Utah, right? It was wild, the engineering back then. They had the Roman irrigation system was crazy sophisticated for the time period.
And plow the fields. We're told
And a lot of the Roman streets are all still perfectly intact underneath the streets in Rome currently.
quite often these people would literally be worked to death. When these people were captured, often by Roman soldiers, they were often taken to the market where they were sold. Anyone could buy himself or herself a slave, and it's said some more wealthy people might own as many as 400 slaves. Perhaps the worst kind of work was in the Roman mines, although historians also
One dude had 500 slaves just for buying and rebuilding properties.
say that slave farmers had a very hard job. Women slaves with less muscle might work in the house as servants, but they might also be given the job of dressmaking or even hairdresser. Many other women were sent to work in small factories where they would make handcrafts and jewelry. The young boys, it's said, were expensive, as it's not likely many Romans wanted old men in their employ. We say employ, but they weren't paid anything. They had to do exactly as they were told, and any kind of backchat could lead to a serious beating. If a slave killed his own master, that would usually end in all the slaves of the household being killed. One might have a nice master, but the opposite was of course possible. As we said before, some slaves gained a certain amount of respect as they were educated. These slaves would often be appointed to the work of teacher for the young Romans. As one writer tells us, how a slave was treated depended on the owner. If a slave was favored by his owner, there was always a chance that this slave could earn his freedom, perhaps the best thing that could happen to a Roman slave. On the other hand, get an awful owner and there was every chance you could be beaten, flogged, branded, maimed, or killed.
I mean, it's like saying you can have a good supervisor or a bad supervisor at your job, right? Like, I don't know about you guys, I've had a lot more bad supervisors than good ones, but the good ones are there. The good ones are there.
One historian writes about the slaves of Pompeii, stating that the average household in the city would have around 7 slaves. He wrote that the work of slaves could be tough, but they were often free to roam about the streets, grab a bit of rest down at the fountain, or just disappear in the crowd. The richer Romans didn't usually walk through the crowded streets, as that would be beneath them. Instead, when they went out, they were carried by slaves on what's called a litter. They are those boxes on sticks you may have seen in the movies. What's surprising?
Right, I'm just gonna check real quick to make sure that we're still up and running on Kick.
Charlie Kirk. LOL.
Okay, we are. Alright, we're good. I just wanted to make sure. Alright, back to business.
Though, according to this historian anyway, is that the slaves were not always identifiable by the clothes they wore. They often wore tunics.
See, I'm not as new as I used to be, but I'm still learning things.
Just like anyone else.
I got most of it down.
Apparently, not so many slave owners would wear togas, as they were too cumbersome and not always easy to clean. As for cleaning, we're told that clothes would often be washed partly with urine. The reason was that it contained lots of ammonia. One of the jobs of a slave, of course, was washing these clothes, so part of their day would be standing in baths of urine. This was likely not the most pleasant job in the world, but laundry detergent was a long way from being invented. As these slaves were property, if they were damaged in some way, say hit by someone's donkey on their way to cleaning duty.
I believe they would also tan stuff, like they would tan leather and like hide and shit with urine. That's where the term they're so broke they don't have a pot to piss in, because people would literally piss in pots and then sell that to the local like tanner, because that's what they would use.
The owner of that donkey would have to pay for the treatment of the slave, or at least pay some money to the slave's owner. Here, we must remember that around 1 out of 5 people across the Roman Empire were slaves at one point, and there was no great feeling of injustice, at least to the Romans. Having slaves was as normal as having people that work for low wages in current-day factories or coffee shops. For the rulers of Rome, the inequality was just part of life. We might also remember that those great Greek philosophers who, for the most part, were noble and extremely clever, said that a perfect society had to have slaves. That's just how it was, and it's likely that Plato or Aristotle just couldn't see it any differently. Remember, in the Roman Empire, the slaves were often the losers of a battle, or at least the surviving citizens of a losing army. The Romans just saw it as their right to take them, but slaves often came by way.
But also, after you conquer let's call it an empire. After you conquer an empire, what are you going to do with all the civilians? Are you just going to kill them all? You obviously you wouldn't want to, but you can't just bring them all in and then expect them to like assimilate to your society. They fucking hate you now. You killed their parents. What? You got to do something.
Way of piracy.
And putting them as slaves is obviously not a good thing, but allowing them the ability to buy their freedom is good, because it teaches them not only to respect the civilization that they're in now, but to conform to its rules, which ultimately is what you would need to do for a successful integration of foreigners to your country.
Or just plain stealing. Gangs of people would go into a town and just take people there, then deliver them by boats or over land to the markets where the Romans would buy them. If those slaves had children with a Roman, those children would also be slaves. One historian tells us that slaves were not allowed to have their own slave families. Life was work, and that was it. The more slaves a Roman had was part of his status. And if you had very special slaves being able to do special things, then that also added to your status. When in public, Roman would often come out with their slaves, showing them off to other Romans. These days, people use things like cars, clothes, bling to do the same thing. And that's what we have to remember, that slaves were seen as mere things, albeit things that could talk. But again, some slaves, the very special ones, did teach things such as philosophy, so we would imagine those slaves had a higher value than someone who spent all day down in a mine digging for gold. Higher
skilled trades do still today have a higher value than like menial labor task, right?
Very much doubt that they spent all day chained, like some of the slaves that were found after Mount Vesuvius erupted in Pompeii. Researchers also said that some of those slaves had been working so much that their bodies were all out of shape. As we said, the best thing that could happen to you is that you could win your freedom, and this did happen. Some Romans used it to make slaves work harder, telling them obedience could pay off. Some historians also tell us that in spite of the occasional slave revolts, it was in the interest of slave owners to treat their slaves well, and so many did. A well-fed slave worked harder and was happier, and would likely not dream all.
Again, terrible that they were property, but most times people take care of their property, so hopefully their normal everyday life wasn't so bad.
Day about sinking a knife into his or her owner. We'll leave you with the words of one writer. No doubt some slave owners were more generous than others, and there was, in a few cases, the possibility of earning one's freedom. But the harsh day-to-day reality of the vast majority of Roman slaves was certainly an unenviable one. No doubt one of the worst jobs a Roman slave could have today would be designing websites from scratch.
We're not talking about Wix, I don't care. So yeah, that's average, the life of an average Roman Empire slave. Much the same as the rest of them. Honestly, a lot of them are relatively similar. If I'm just being honest, a lot of the ancient slaveries are all pretty similar. Anybody could find themselves becoming a slave because every person could be property of any other person at any given time. The highest of generals could find himself a slave to the baker, right? The richest of business owners could find himself a slave to a teacher. Teachers could find themselves a slave to the blacksmith, stuff like that. And it all really just depended, and there were many ways that you could find yourself a slave. Now, I'm not saying that is at all the same as what happened with American slavery, but I am saying that it is proof that slavery was a human sin. It was a bad thing that humans as a whole did to other humans, and it does not have to be a class or race war of any kind, right? I don't know why people try to make it that way. Well, I know why people try to make it that way, but they need to understand that it is not at all that, okay? There have been just as many, if not probably more, white slaves in history than there were ever black slaves in history. Definitely like this video. Definitely follow me on Kick. Definitely put in the chat, put in comment sections, let me know. If you were a gladiator in the Roman Colosseum, what would your fighting style be? And you can only use the weapons that were available in the time. You can't I'm going to show up with a gun and kill everybody. No. That's not how it works. You have to do it. Anyway, follow me on Kick. Follow me on X at real_Cestal. Follow me on or subscribe to me on YouTube at youtube.com/Cestal_G2D because I am the second coming. You can also look for me on Rumble if you're tired of YouTube. At rumble.com/Cestal. I am everywhere that videos are made, and I look forward to hearing from you guys. All right, I'll see you next week. Bye.